I'm going to talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll open it wide for questions. So if you've got questions at any point, just note them down, and we'll have lots of time to entertain it before we wrap up by about 10 o'clock. But I want to talk about living at a sustainable pace. And here's the problem. I run into so many leaders in law, leaders in finance, leaders in the church space where I spent 25 years, leaders who are CEOs, entrepreneurs, running the companies of the people that you serve. And here's what I find, that they're overwhelmed, they're overcommitted, and they're overworked, doing exactly what they want to do with their lives. And I found myself in that position. My first exposure to it probably came, well, over 25 years ago. I'm a graduate of Osgoode Hall. I met a number of lawyers already. How many of you have training in law or are also lawyers? Or we just were magnetically drawn to each other. Okay, that was it. I just thought, so I met the one. Anyway, I went to Osgoode Hall. From the time I was 8 years old, I had wanted to be a lawyer. There has to be a lot wrong with you as a child to want to be a lawyer, but all of that stuff was wrong with me. And I thought, where do I want to go? Got into the law school of my dreams at Osgoode. Best thing to come out of law school was my wife, Tony. We were in the same section, first year law. I noticed her, she did not notice me. And I asked her out, and we've been married over 30 years now. And I got a chance to, there was a bit of a detour in the middle of law school, and I won't go into a lot of details today, but I was raised in a Christian home and I'm a person of faith. But never ever thought I would go into ministry. To me, on a list of 100 career choices, that was number 117. Like, last thing you'd want to do with your life, never thought about that. But in the middle of law school, felt a tug into ministry, another story for another day. But I decided to complete law, finished up at Osgoode, articled in downtown Toronto at a firm that eventually got absorbed by Miller Thomson. And I got to see what it was like, what my life would have been like if I practiced law. And it was really interesting because I was about 25, 27 years old. And I noticed I was surrounded by highly successful people who did not like their lives. I mean, they had the horse farm up in King City. They had so many Lexuses, they had Lexi. I mean, they were making a pile of money. I mean, I don't know why, as a law student, I knew how much the lawyers made, but they were making, back in the 90s, over $500,000 a year. And they were concerned because given the economy, we're in a recession, they could take a 10% pay cut. Now me, making a fraction of what they had is like, I could take a 10% pay cut and still pay my bills, and you guys are worried about losing, from $600,000 to $500,000 a year, but they were. And I remember there was one principal in the firm, I got his permission to use this story, not in At Your Best, but the book I wrote before that. I had to look him up, and I said, do you mind if I tell this story? He goes, oh yeah, that was definitely me. Anyway, he used to buy a lottery ticket every week. And I remember one day, it was a Friday afternoon, he came by my desk, and I'm the low person on the totem pole there, and he waves the lottery ticket in my face, and he goes, if I win this thing, you will never see my face again. Now, how does that feel when you're the owner of the firm, the principal in the firm? Like, not particularly good. I led a church for 25 years. How would it be if I stood up one day and said to my congregation, hey, if I win this thing, I'll never preach another sermon again? Like, that's just weird. But that's what I saw, and I thought, there's something about that. Like, you can get everything you want and not be happy. And you probably are facing clients who are in that position. Maybe there's one or two of you who are in that position now. You're like, you know what? If I go back to 18-year-old me and I prescripted my life, I probably couldn't have planned it any better. I got money in the bank. I got a house or two or three. I've got amazing clients. Some of you already told me about your clients. And yet I find myself overworked, overwhelmed, and overcommitted, doing exactly what I dreamed I would do. So I went a little bit about my story. I went from law into ministry, went and switched degrees, finished up at Osgoode, got called to the bar, resigned, and went into seminary at U of T. And then went to, and I know we're not all people of faith here, which is fine, the principles apply no matter what, but found these three little churches north of Toronto in Oro-Medonte. A lot of you pass that on your way to your cottage up in Muskoka. But three little churches. One of them is on the highway, actually. Next time you're going Highway 11 South, it's now Christadelphian. We sold that building 20 years ago. But that was a church that actually had an average attendance of 6 people. So I went from an office tower in Toronto to 6 people. Like, this row right there, that second row, that's the church. And I would do a circuit on Sunday morning. There were 3 of them, and they had no money. The budget, you would love this as accountants and people who serve accountants. The budget of that first church was $6,000 for the year. That was it. Well, 6 people. What are you going to do? They were giving sacrificially, I guess. The second church on the circuit on Sunday morning had an average attendance of 14. And then the mega church had 23 people in it. So this guy comes up, doesn't know ministry. I've never served in a rural context, still not sure about my calling. And I got the wiring of a lawyer. Like, I'm not a chaplain. I don't hold people's hands and cry with them. I'm like, get your life together. Like, what is wrong with you? And so I don't even have the skill set of a lawyer, of a pastor. And so I'm really confused. But by the grace of God, things started to grow. And 6 became 16, became 60. And soon we were at capacity in these little tiny historic churches. We eventually amalgamated them. We went to an elementary school, became a portable church, and then we built a multi-million-dollar facility. And so the first decade was just up and to the right. We became, in our denomination, the fastest growing church in the denomination, and I think the second or third largest in the country. And I've got whiplash. I don't know what's going on. I've got 2 kids, they're young. And you don't have time constraints when you've got 6 people that you're serving. If you have 6 clients, you got a pretty good life. You're broke, but you got a pretty good life if you've got 6 clients, right? It's not bad. But all of a sudden it's 600 and then 800. And like my brain started to melt. That was the attendance on Sunday morning. And like there were probably 1,500 people who called our church home. And after 1,000, I just started deleting names. I couldn't keep up. And I had a terrible equation, which was more people equals more hours. Now, that's hard enough if you're practicing law or if you're in accounting, but if you add some personal faith component to it, where you really believe in what you're doing, it gets super confusing because more hours feels like more faithfulness. You know what I mean? And after a decade, I hit a wall. In many ways, I was at the top of my game. I got the opportunity, I'm in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody to talk to. I started in almost the pre-internet days. And I was anxious to learn from anybody I could learn. How do you handle a growing church? How do you break growth barriers? All that stuff. And eventually, I found my way down to some leaders in Atlanta, Georgia. And I got an opportunity, one of America's, still to this day, one of the largest mega churches. I got on their radar, and they invited me to come and give my first keynote talk. There were 2,500 people gathered from around the world. One of the top communicators in the U.S. is sitting there in the front row. At his invitation, I get to speak. And I'm nervous. This is like the TED Talk in church circles. I'm super nervous. I practiced for months for this talk. And by all accounts, it was a home run. People talked to me about that talk for a decade after I gave it. And I think, this is it. We just won the Super Bowl. And they flew my family down. They were in the front row. And I remember feeling like I was on top of the world. And then we flew back from Atlanta to Toronto, landed at Pearson, and it's like I fell off a cliff. I'm a pretty passionate person, but emotionally I just went flat. Flat. I felt no passion, no drive, lost my motivation, lost my joy. And at first I thought, okay, I'm really tired. Must be really tired. So I took 3 weeks off. And after 3 weeks of resting, it didn't get better, it got worse. And I'm like, uh-oh. And I went to our governing board, our elders, and I just said, look, I don't know what's wrong, but I'm broken. And I don't know what to do about that. And they said, do you want a sabbatical? It's nice, eh? In church world, they give you stuff like sabbaticals. And I'm like, hey man, if I take a sabbatical, I know I'm never coming back. So I can't do that. I can't do that. And I felt at 40 like my life was over. I thought, I got no gifts, I got no passion, I've got no energy, I've got no drive. I remember I'm 6'2", my wife is 5'3", and I got this like fear of people. I think I was peopled out, which is weird as a pastor, How do you get peopled out? But I felt peopled out. I couldn't handle another person. I'd walk into a room like this and I'd try to hide behind her so I wouldn't have to engage any of you. I was that afraid of people. And that went on all through the summer of 2006. Now, I had enough muscle memory that by the time August rolled around, that keynote talk happened in late April, early May. By the time August rolled around, I'd had part of the summer off, and I thought, okay, I'll get up there and I'll try a talk in front of our congregation. And I got up and I had enough muscle memory that some of the people who knew what was going on lined up to talk to me after, and they said, "You're back." And I'm like, I'm glad it feels that way on the outside because it doesn't feel that way on the inside. And I spent the next few months just trying to get any flicker of passion back. And by September, I felt the first little flame, the first little bit of joy around, oh, I get to do this, and there's a future, and I'm like my heart started to beat again. But it took 3 to 5 years to get me to the point where I really felt 100%. And what I became in those 3 to 5 years was a student of, number one, how do I make sure this never happens again? Because it was so awful. And if you burned out, you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemies. And some of you might feel that. I don't know, maybe you feel that right now. Talking to people this morning, getting ready for this day. I mean, some of you are in the crosshairs of the Great Resignation. Some people couldn't be here today. Why? Because somebody else quit last week. And that means now you have all of their clients and all of their workload, and you wish that they filed things properly, but they didn't, and now you've got to sort through all of that. And some of you have gotten to that point where you're like, okay, great, I am overwhelmed, I'm overworked, I'm overcommitted, doing exactly what I thought I wanted to do with my life, and I'm well paid for it, and I don't get it. I don't get it. And so I became a student of like, how do I make sure this never happens again? And what I discovered, because when you're in the gutter, when you're at the bottom, you feel like you're all alone. You feel like nobody can understand my pain, nobody gets it. But what I've learned is I'm not alone. Do you know that 70% of adults in their 20s and 30s say they're experiencing some level of burnout? I was at an event in Dallas. I was there with Pat Lencioni and a few other business leaders, and there's about 800 in the room. And the event organizer decided that we should do a live polling of the room. And so I asked people, I said, this is from Gallup or whatever, but I just asked the people in the room, most of whom were ministry or business leaders. I just said, how many of you have experienced the symptoms of burnout in the last 12 months? This is in 2019. We didn't even have a pandemic to mess with our heads. And when they put the results on the screen, I had to stop. I choked up. 93% of the people in the room said they had experienced some of the signs of burnout in the last year. It's an epidemic. Last year, this is from Deloitte, 82% of senior executives regularly finish work feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. In other words, maybe I'm not burned out, but I leave it all at the office. And maybe the office is your laptop these days, but like when I close that laptop, I got nothing left for my family. I got nothing left other than to maybe stare at Netflix or have a glass of wine or just put my feet up. I got nothing left. 82% of senior executives, you're not alone. And you know what we tell ourselves? We tell ourselves, well, it's probably just a busy season, right? And my son trained to be an accountant as well. He worked downtown at BDO for a year and then joined my firm about 3 years ago, joined my company. But so I know all about busy season for accountants, right? That time between January and May where you're running nonstop. June, thank you, June. July, do I hear July or August? Anybody? We're gonna bid this up. Yeah, but you know, busy season. And I used to justify that all the time because tomorrow I fly out to Minneapolis. Tonight I pick up my wife from Nashville. Next week I fly to Cabo to speak at a conference there. By the way, if you ever get invited to a conference in Cabo, go. All of the keynotes are delivered in a pool at a 5-star resort. So I'm like, best speaking gig ever. Anyway, that's where I'm going. So it's busy. And, I used to tell people all the time, oh, it's just a busy season. It's just a busy season. It's just a busy season. But if that's what you're saying all the time, it's probably not just a busy season. It's your life. And some of you looking back on the last 2 years, sure, they've been weird. But you can go back 5 years, you can go back 10 years, and you can say, my life has just been one busy season after another. So, what do you do with all that? You know where it lands us? And this is the problem, and then we'll diagnose it, and then we'll get into some solutions before we wrap up. It lands in what I diagnosed as the stress spiral. This is my life if I'm not paying attention to what I'm telling you about today, because I have more inbound than I possibly know what to do with. You know, leaders are blessed. Leaders access the content we produce 1.5 million times a month. It's insane. I have a whole team that just basically handles inbound for us. And some of you have that. You're turning away clients. You're saying, I don't have the opportunity. And here's what happens. You get into a stress spiral. How do you get overwhelmed, overcommitted, and overworked? There's 3 principal assets you and I as information knowledge workers deal with every day. Time, energy, and priorities. And when I'm in a stress spiral, my time is unfocused, my energy is unleveraged, and my priorities continually get hijacked by other people. So if you really think about it, what is our currency as leaders? What is our currency as knowledge workers? It's time, it's energy, and priorities. And when you don't manage them well, and there have been great seasons of my life, this is what led me to burnout: unfocused time, unleveraged energy, hijacked priorities. More people, more clients cannot always equal more hours. If you're moving from 6 to 60, sure. From 60 to 600, not gonna work. 600 to 6,000, you're dead in the water with that. So you gotta figure out, well, what do I do with my time, energy, and priority? If you don't focus it, you don't leverage it, and you allow it to be hijacked, you end up overwhelmed, overcommitted, and overworked. So how do you solve the stress spiral? You know what the number one answer is? Survey says, you do this. And I'll bet you are great at doing that. How many of you, and I know COVID notwithstanding, love vacations like that? Hands up. I do, and I bet you vacation really well. Some of you are probably at the point where you can take a month off. Right? You're like, we spent some time in the French Riviera. My wife and I, we went to the Algarve in Portugal this spring, sort of a second honeymoon. We honeymooned in Portugal, and it was amazing. But you know what the problem is? You get back from that paradise vacation, and literally the next week, Monday morning, 11 a.m., you're dead in the water. You're exhausted. By 11 a.m. on your first day back, you're so tired. So, here's the problem. Time off won't heal you, when the problem is how you spend your time on. And most of us do time off really well. We know how to do it. We have the cottage. We've got, multiple properties. We've got the resort if we want the resort. But our problem isn't how we spend time off. The problem is how we spend our time on. So vacations, time off, and even sabbaticals are not the cure for an unsustainable pace. I know so many people in my field of the last 25 years, lots of people get sabbaticals, and what happens is 6 months later, they're gone. Why? Because the sabbatical wasn't the problem. It was when they got back, they went back into their crazy, unsustainable pace and their roadkill a few months later. A sustainable pace is actually the solution for an unsustainable pace. And in those 3 to 5 years, when I was sort of reconsidering how I would live my life and how do I never get back to burnout, I started to think about those 3 principal assets: time, energy, and priorities. And I started to think, well, what if I approached them fundamentally differently? What could happen? And I want to walk you through just a few principles today that I hope can be implementable tonight. Like this afternoon, you can start making some changes, and I hope it'll help. So in contrast to the stress spiral, I started to rethink about, okay, how could I rearrange how I handle time, energy, and priorities to start thriving and really be at my best? And the answer for me, and we've been able to train thousands of leaders in this, is start focusing your time, start leveraging your energy, start realizing your own priorities, and then you'll start to thrive. And hopefully, you'll be at your best. And I want to break those down one by one. By the way, I'm happy to make this slide deck available to Peggy. So if any of you want it when we're done, we'll get that to you. We'll make it available to you free of charge. So stop just managing time. You probably read 1 million time management books. You've heard the talks. And there's a lot of good material out there. And in fact, I would have said at the time I burned out, I had read the stuff too. I was pretty good at time management. The problem is you're managing a fixed asset. That's the problem with time management. Time management can make you more efficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean it can make you more effective. In fact, there's a diminishing return with time management. And after I burned out, I came to this really, really stark realization that every leader gets the same amount of time every day. I used to sit there all through my 30s. People are like, Carey, why don't you write a book? You know what my answer would be? I don't have time to write a book. I got churches that are exploding, and like I got people to serve and people to see and a staff to lead, and I got stuff. I don't have time to write a book. I don't have time to work on that project around the house. I don't have time to start a podcast. I don't have time to do that. And then I realized one day, every leader gets the same amount of time every day. If you're leading a Fortune 50 company, you get the same 24 hours in a day that I get. Elon Musk has 24 hours in a day, and he's colonizing Mars and revolutionizing the auto industry. I mean, it's insane. 24 hours, listening to a podcast with him yesterday. He says every minute of thinking now can add $1 million of value to Tesla. Like, what? Elon Musk has the same amount of time I do. He has the same amount of time you do. So what I did was I taught myself to do this. Stop saying you don't have the time. I had to stop saying I don't have the time to write a book. I have the time to write a book. And then you do this. Start admitting you didn't make it. You've got time for that client. You just didn't make it. You have time for those of you who are married or in a relationship. I've got time for my wife. I just didn't make it. I've got time to see my client. I didn't make it. I've got time to tuck my kids or grandkids in at bed at night. I just didn't make it. How many of us, some of you probably have young kids at home. You ever done the story time cheat thing that I used to do? You're reading the storybook with your 2-year-old and you skip a page. You ever done that? And your 2-year-old's like, hey, wait a minute, you skipped a page? And you're like, you can't even read. Like, how do you know I skipped a page? But you skipped a page because you're so time pressured. You do the working vacation. You know what I've learned far too recently? Working vacations don't work. You're not really on and you're not really off. And so everything suffers. So anyway, you've got the time. What do you want to do? Think about those things on your list that you're like, yeah, I just didn't get to it. I just didn't get to it. You actually have the time to do it. Now that's a really sobering admission that you start saying you didn't make the time and then start managing your energy. So what I want to say, let me go back a little bit. What you want to do is when somebody asks you, you start to prioritize your task. We'll get into prioritization in a minute. But if a client, and you know, there's that, it's always the clients who have the least who demand the most. Do you ever notice that? So people who are really worried about their $5 and you're like, I got a client with 10 million. He's not worried, you're worried. What do we do with that? What do we do with that pesky client, with the one who's calling all the time? Well, maybe you have a slot for that client. But the reality is you're just going to say, you know what, I'm not going to make the time for that. When you have a lot of inbound, and a lot of you have a lot of inbound, it's always a choice. You got to decide, is this one the most important thing I can do? So if you start doing this exercise on the inside, like some of you, you've been meaning to see your mom and have lunch with her for a while. And your mom calls, it's like, when are we going to see you? You're like, I don't have time for that. Sorry, Mom. If a month goes by and you don't have time for your mother, something is wrong. Right? That's when, if you get really honest with yourself, if you're always pushing your kids off, always pushing your partner off, always pushing friends off, always pushing the things that are good for you, exercise, going to the gym, that kind of stuff, off, you got to start making time for that. When I burned out, I wasn't eating right, I wasn't exercising, and I wasn't sleeping properly. In fact, I went to my doctor and I just said, I'm not feeling great. And he said, well, are you eating well? I'm like, does Dairy Queen count? He's like, nope. And he goes, are you sleeping well? I'm like, who sleeps well? I get 5 or 6 hours a night, maybe if I'm lucky. He goes, are you exercising? I'm like, well, my kids work out. Like, do I get some credit for that? He's like, no. Since I burned out, like it's an off day for me, but yesterday morning worked out for about 45 minutes. I took up cycling. I've got about 2,300 kilometers, I think, on my bike this summer. I love going to American audiences because you say 2,300 kilometers. They go, how many miles it is? You say it's about 28,000 miles. Just do the translation for them. It's fantastic. But I made time for all that. And to eat properly, I'm down 20, 25 pounds from when I was in my 30s. I slept 7.5 hours last night, even though it was an early morning wake-up call. Why? Because I had the time for it. I just wasn't making it. Then, and this is where it really starts to take off, you start managing your energy. So every leader gets 24 equal hours in a day, but not all hours feel equal or produce equally. And you probably noticed that. Here's the test, and this is a live poll. How many of you would say you're morning people? Hands up. How many of you are night owls? Okay, sorry you're here at an early morning talk. That's too bad. How many of you would say you're zombies all day long? Joke, no, right? But a lot of us, there is a chronology to your body type. Daniel Pink writes a really good book called When, if you really want to go into the science of how your body behaves at different times in the day. I'm definitely a morning person, and basically, so you're getting me at my peak. I basically produce my best content in the morning. If I'm writing a chapter for a book, if I'm writing a keynote address, if I'm writing a weekend message, writing at 8 a.m. feels completely different and produces totally different results than writing at 8 p.m. For some of you, writing or strategizing or doing a detailed review for your client works way better at 8 p.m. than it does at 8 a.m. Now, the good news is we're not factory workers, so we get to decide when we work. We don't have to be there at 7 a.m., punch the clock, leave for lunch, come back, and then punch the clock again at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We get to decide what we do. And you have to start thinking about, okay, well, when do I produce my best work? And for me, mornings are my gold mine. That's when the creative juices flow, when my energy is high, when I have my best ideas. It's not that the rest of the day is a total write-off, but I just do best in the mornings. And so this is actually my energy clock. If you look at it, I usually wake up between 5 and 6 a.m. And then 6 a.m., which is at the top of the clock, you're kind of getting moving at 7. I take a personal hour to do some personal things and get ready for the day. And then from 7 to 11 a.m., that is my peak zone. That's when I'm at my best. And that's when I produce my best content. I kind of lose a little momentum before lunch, have some lunch. I'm actually okay after lunch. And then that red zone, the red zone is a time of day where you need toothpicks to keep your eyes open, where you need that double espresso even to make it through the meeting, and where you're dragging your knuckles just to stay awake. Think about when that is for you. For a lot of people, as I've polled leaders, it's after lunch. It's like that 2 to 4 o'clock slump happens. I call that your red zone. So green zone, your energy is at your peak. Red zone, you're almost comatose. And then your yellow zone is everything in between. You're pretty good. You're just not at your best, and you're definitely not at your worst. So try to figure out what that looks like in your life, and I'll give you a downloadable free resource at the end if you want more. And then here's the secret. Do what you're best at when you're at your best. So all of you have a lot of responsibilities in your job, but my guess is you've got 1 or 2 or 3 things that really determine the value add to your client. Like, what is it? What is it about your planning? What is it about your client relations? What is it about your work that really makes you best in field? And I realized this late in the game, what is the thing? I was talking to this guy yesterday who helped me figure this out about 10 years ago. But I was trying to figure out, it's such a weird thing. I did radio when I was in my teens, and then I started publishing a syndicated newspaper column at 19. Who does that? It was just local up in in the Muskoka area. And then I went into law, I spent a year in court. That was so much fun, just going to court almost every day. I loved that, did not enjoy solicitor's work. I was really on the barrister side. And then what was my favorite part of a job as a pastor? It was preaching. And then I go on to become a podcaster and an author and a speaker. What's the common thread in all that? Communications. That if you really want to look at what I'm best at, it's probably communications. Now, maybe you've heard much better communicators, I'm sure you have, but that is sort of the thing that I bring to the world, is I can communicate. I can communicate in writing and books. I can communicate publicly. That's what I do. Some of you, just walking into a room and those 10 minutes where you look at a whole portfolio, a whole estate planning thing, you try to figure it out, you're like, oh, this is what's missing. That's your superpower. I don't know what it is. Some of you can talk nervous people off a ledge. That's your superpower. I don't know what it is. You know your field better than I do. But you've, particularly at this point in your career, you probably figured out. When I was in my 20s, I thought I was great at everything. And now that I'm in my 50s, I'm actually, I'm probably a decent communicator, and that's about it. Don't ask me to plan a project. Don't ask me to do administration. Don't ask me to file an expense report. I trust people with the accounting. I do all that. I'm basically a communicator. I come from ministry. I have no skills. Okay, so this is it. It's just communication. That's it. So the secret is do what you're best at when you're at your best. Now, I think, how do you know what you're at your best at? It's gifting, passion, and impact. So what are you gifted at? What are you naturally good at? I know people who can hear a song on Spotify, sit down and play it on guitar or keyboard. No problem. I can't even sing it. But they have a gift in that area. A friend of mine defines it this way. What seems easy and effortless to you that looks complicated to other people? That's your gifting. Passion, what do you love doing? There's probably on the 10 things you need to do in your job, there's probably 2 that you're really excited about and 3 that you hate. Well, a lot of you are at the stage in your life where you don't have to do the things you hate, because the things you hate, other people love. And you can maybe focus on those top 2 or 3 things. That's your passion, you love. Like I was preparing this afternoon, I'm interviewing Chris Anderson, who started TED Talks or took it over in 2002. I am so excited for that. I'm watching interviews that he's done. I'm reading his book and I'm like, how did this become my job? I love doing that. And then impact. What do you do that seems to have an impact? When you leave the room, everyone's like, man, I'm so glad she was there. I'm so glad he was there. I'm so glad we had her on this project. Like, what is it that creates impact? And I know if I'm communicating well, if the vision is clear, if my team is aligned wherever I'm leading, that everything's going to be okay. When I get off mission on any of those, that's where I get in trouble. So that's how you determine what you're best at: gifting, passion, and impact. And then what you do is you do what you're best at when you're at your best. So you take those things that you are best at, and you know what? You'll be tempted to do the opposite. Here's why you do the opposite. Because you're like, oh, that stuff's easy for me. I'll put it off. I'll do the client breakfast. I'll do this meeting. I'll do that meeting. And what happens is you get to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're exhausted. And you know what? I can put a talk together when I'm exhausted. But it'll never be good. It certainly never has the potential to be great. But imagine what can happen if you take your unique gifting, your passion, and the impact, and you start putting that in a place where you're actually at your best. That's when things start to take off. So this is my priorities chart. You can make up your own. In my green zone, I do writing, strategy, and talk preparation. I don't usually do morning talk, so this is a treat to be able to do it. But I was working in the car on the way down. Don't worry, I had a driver, okay? Wasn't a Tesla. But anyway, I was working in the car on the way down because I knew I could finish a post for next week. And then yellow, I do short-term projects, calendar management, which is a big part of our life, podcast interviews, one-on-one team meetings. Interestingly enough, in the field I'm in, I'm probably best known for my leadership podcast. I don't do the interviews in my green zone, but I do the prep in my green zone. Because if I'm prepared, I can do just fine in my yellow zone. And then red zone, emails, routine meetings, expense reports, exercise, or honestly, naps. Nothing wrong with a good nap. Churchill used to nap during the Second World War. Reagan napped. A lot of people napped. It's a good thing. And it's all those things. So for me, that's not critical. Now, I have an assistant, an EA, who sorts through hundreds of emails a day. If she does that in her red zone, we're in big trouble because we've angered a lot of people with sloppy replies. So she has to do that in her green zone. I don't have to. So that's how you put it together. And then finally, this is where it all comes together. Refuse to let your priorities get hijacked. This is one thing I realized. No one will ever ask you to accomplish your top priorities. You know, you got this list of things to do, whether that's in Asana or in your software, or a written list, you've got these things to do. Nobody will ever ask you to complete your top priorities. They will only ask you to complete theirs. If you think about it, that's how society works, right? Every text message, every email you get, every DM is somebody putting their priorities on you. Hey, can you? Hey, Paul. Hey, Peter. Hey, Hillary. Hey, can you, Nicholas? Can you do this? Can you do this? And what happens is the inbound overtakes our lives to the point where nothing on our list, personal or significant, gets done. So you have to decide as a result how you will spend your time before others decide for you. And this was a huge difference in my life. I used to be very reactive, and if I had an open slot on my calendar, I said, yeah, I'm free, I can do that. If you look at your calendar, and this is an interesting exercise, if you go into September now, go into January of 2023. What do you have booked in your calendar? Most of our calendars look like this in January. And you know what we tell ourselves? January is going to be amazing. But that's what you thought about September, and September's been a train wreck, right? You're like, September looked wide open, and then it got super busy. I can show you January of 2027 in my calendar. Oh yeah, I should say this. Blank space on your calendar is a trap. It looks like freedom, but it's jail disguised as liberty. Because what happens is you're like, oh yeah, October's going to be great. You know, January's going to be great. If I show you what is next on my calendar, it's very different. Because a blank calendar is pretty much a guarantee that you'll spend time on everyone else's priorities, not yours. That's what happens when you have an open slot. It's like, can you do coffee? You're like, yep. Can you do breakfast? Sure. I canceled breakfast meetings because I realized I was burning jet fuel. I do almost no breakfast meetings anymore because if I'm doing a breakfast meeting, you know how they go. You meet at 7, and then it goes a half hour later than you thought, and then you go to drive-through to get some coffee, and then you go into the office, and people talk to you in the office, and then it's 11 o'clock and you're ready for lunch. What do you get done? Nothing. Nothing. My calendar looks like this. You go to January 2027, it looks like that. I've already decided ahead of time because your life is a series of repeated patterns. You guys are in a particular field. You do the same thing all the time. I can predict, I don't know what I'm going to be writing in 2027 or January of 2023, but I'm going to be writing something, whether that's a keynote, a book, a talk, an article. So I do writing, strategy, talk preparation. Then I got short-term meetings. Then I've got some, free time. And then look what it says on Saturday and Sunday, family and personal time. I fell into this trap all the time where I would be at some event at the church and people would say, hey, what are you doing Saturday? And I go, nothing. And they say, oh, good, maybe you can come and help me move, or maybe you can come to this party I'm doing. And then you're trapped. And I gave up way too many Saturdays when my kids were young. And I would come home and my wife would say, why are you doing that on Saturday? Like, we're all off. Now I just look at my calendar and I say, oh, you know what? I got a commitment. And then they say, well, what's your commitment? I say, it's to my family. And they're like, is your family more important than I am? And then you say, yes, they are. You can get another advisor, okay? That's what you say. It's my pastoral skills coming through. Then the other thing that we always feel like victims, but I kind of realized, you know what? Maybe there's 20 hours you can't control. Some of you work in firms, you're not all the principal. I talk to leaders all the time. It's like, great, Carey, that's great for you. You run your own company, you can do what you want. But if you really look, you get 168 hours in a week. And I've talked to thousands of office workers about this. You think about it, okay, I'm not principal, I'm junior in my firm, I'm trying to figure this out. Of a 40-hour work week, how many hours are really not in your control? The answer for most people is maximum 20, more likely 5 to 12. Yeah, we have that team meeting Tuesday at 1. Yes, I've got this standing meeting with my direct reports Thursday. But you know what that means? Even in a place where you can't control half your work week, you have total control over 148 hours every single week. So here's the mantra I've adopted over the last few years. Live in a way today that will help you thrive tomorrow. Live in a way, and ask yourself this question. And actually, this is a good week to talk about this because tonight I'm back in Toronto picking up my wife from Nashville. Tomorrow, I have a midday flight to Minneapolis. Then we're back. Then we have a concert. I think it's Trevor Noah in Toronto Saturday night. Then we got some commitments Sunday, and I fly out Monday to go to Mexico. So what have I done? I preloaded my work. I'm still going to get my workouts in. I'm still going to get my sleep in. And I set aside tonight and tomorrow morning to catch up with my wife. Why? Because I have to live in a way today that will help me thrive tomorrow. And that's what my hope is for you. So if you want more, you can scan the QR code or text @yourbest to that number. It'll give you a link that will give you a burnout assessment indicator and also some free resources related to this talk. But my hope for you is that you live in a way today that will help you thrive tomorrow. All right, I'd love to take some questions. Any questions or pushback or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
Could you talk more about this burnout? Because I think in our industry, we work long hours in the accounting industry. So,
Yeah.
we keep hearing the word burnout, and I think it's more of a personal thing based on the individual. So, in the sense that some people get burnout in one way, and other people get burnout in a different way, and there may be so many different types of burnout that we probably just don't understand when we're burnt out, or maybe we do, I don't know.
It's a very perceptive question. Did everybody hear it? Can you define burnout a little more? And we'll talk about that a little bit, for sure. So I'm not a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, but in my mind, there are two levels of burnout. What I experienced 16 years ago was full-on burnout. Basically, I didn't declare a finish line, so my body did. It feels a lot like clinical depression. If you look at the symptoms for clinical depression and burnout, they're very similar. Your joy is gone, your energy is gone, lots of brain fog. I think a lot of people, and there would probably be candidates in this room, go a level down. I call that sort of mid-grade burnout. Here's some of the symptoms. Your joy and energy are gone. You just don't have the passion you used to have. Maybe, when you graduated, you used to be very optimistic, and you're not anymore. Second can be that you've grown really cynical. If you've seen one client, you've seen them all. If you've seen one case, you've seen them all. A third can be brain fog. Another dangerous symptom is self-medication. So that could be alcohol or drugs, obviously, but it's a lot more subtle than that. I was a pastor. You're not supposed to do that stuff. So what we do? Food and work, right? You just eat. It's emotional eating. So I was doing a lot of emotional eating. Workaholism is the most rewarded addiction in North America. If you drink too much, you get fired. If you work too much, you get a raise and a promotion. So it's very, very seductive. And the problem with us, well, with you guys in particular, is if you work more, you can make more money. But at what price? And at what cost? Your soul, your life, your relationships. And I was watching in law all those years ago, I was seeing people at the top of their game professionally whose personal life, they were on marriage number 2, marriage number 3. And is that really the life they wanted to be living? I don't think so. So there's that, self-medication. And there's a difference between self-care and self-medication. Self-care is healthy. Tonight, we're going to hop in the hot tub. We're going to catch up. Self-indulgence is, I only take hot tubs. Or, I'm at the spa every day. That's self-indulgence. Self-care is very different. It's the idea that you're refueling to give back, not refueling just because that's all you've got. Some other symptoms, these are really subtle. You don't laugh anymore. Like nothing's funny. Nothing's enjoyable. Those are some symptoms that come to mind. If you do that QR code, there is a burnout assessment that we've run. Again, it's not medical. It's just helped thousands of leaders figure out, wow, I got some things I need to pay attention to. The good news is if it's mid-grade burnout, the recovery is pretty easy to make. If you make some of these basic changes, some of the other ones we talk about in our teaching, you can probably feel a lot better a month from now, 2 months from now. Does that help, Carlos?
Yeah.
Tell me more. What else?
What else? I think if you have the full-fledged burnout, there's a probability that coming back to work really makes it hard.
It does. Yeah, if you have full-fledged burnout, what I had to do was I had created work at a very unsustainable pace. I was reactive. I let other people determine my priorities. I defaulted to yes, not no. In the book, which you just got, I think probably for asking the first question, you'll see there's a whole section on priority management, including default no's. So let me walk you through a little bit of that right now. What I had to learn to do, and think about this in a growing church. So imagine a synagogue, a mosque, a church, or whatever. You got, well, eventually when I handed Connexus off, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people who called our church home. And the answer to, I handed that off to my successor, I should say. The answer to, can I meet with you, was on default, no. And the reason was I set up systems for thousands of people to connect if they wanted to in small groups so that it didn't suck my time all the time so I could focus on mission. Right now, we still say no to about 90% of our speaking engagements. We look at, are there leaders in the room? You know, does this fit with my schedule? Is it too many? I default to no on how to pick your brain. Anytime somebody asks me, can I pick your brain? It's generally a very gracious no. But otherwise, if I start saying yes to that, I don't have time to do this. I'm frazzled when I show up. I haven't written a good book. I've written a book, but it's not a good book, and that sort of thing. So I think defaulting to no. So it's that point we talked about earlier. You know, time off won't heal you when the problem is how you spend time on. So it's making fundamental changes to what you say yes to and your weekly rhythm. I was talking to a leader recently who I interviewed for my leadership podcast, who says he keeps his ideal week on his calendar next to his real week. He just set it up that way. So, you know, your ideal week is kind of like when everything was going right, when you had enough time for your family, you had enough time to work out and get some sleep, and you did the right client work. That's your ideal week. And most of the time, I would say 50 to 60% of the time, you can get your week there. And then if you're in a high travel season like I am in the month of October, okay, we know that, but then we put some other stuff aside, so I'm not up at the hotel until midnight answering emails and then up at 5 a.m. again to work out. But you're right, it's a fundamental readjustment.
Yeah.
Paul.
Carey, one of the things I find is that emails, because people can send them without taking a lot of time, their time, well, you just have so many coming at you. And are you using any voice recognition software to actually respond more efficiently? And part two of that, Craig Scott of mine over here works with me. He's now responding to the majority of my emails. And are you doing that, is your EA doing that under your name or their name?
Yeah, that's a pro tip, Paul, that you're hinting at for anybody who's got a lot of clients is, well, I have a friend in real estate. Some of you see his signs all the way up to Muskoka, the Ferris team. So Mark's a really good friend. And if you follow, I think they're the #1 firm in Canada right now in terms of real estate. And Mark turns 40 in December. So he's done really, really well. Anyway, Mark, you know, started by selling houses. And then he started selling VIP houses. And then about 5 years ago, transitioned to CEO. And now he doesn't sell any houses. And what happened to me was, as our church grew, I had a public email anybody could access. And then I started 2 email accounts, a public one and a private one. Almost every high capacity leader I know does that. So I have a private email. I might get 7 to 10 emails a day. And then my team handles all the rest. And if you think about juniors in your firm, if you think about how that works, you know, particularly if you're principal in your firm or you're a senior partner or that kind of thing, your rate is not a student rate. It's not a first-year associate rate. It's a much higher rate. You should be answering much higher questions. So to go to that kind of tiered email system, I don't think is a problem. You just have to train your clients for it and say, hey, from now on, so-and-so is going to be taking your questions. And obviously, if they can't solve it, I'm here to help as well. But that's a really good strategy. The other thing is communication channels are really important. And so we in my little company, which is only 7 of us, we are not allowed to email each other. We have to use Slack or Asana, and we default to Asana. So we have a triage, like just to reduce the inbound. Another thing that happens is a lot of emails, there are meetings that could have been an email, but then there are emails that could have been in a meeting. And what you should do is, I have ideas all the time in my Asana, which we use for project management. So whatever project management Basecamp you use, I have 3 standing meetings a week. If I have something I need to talk to Sam about, I just put it in there, and then it's flagged. It's what David Allen, Getting Things Done, says, you close the loop. I'm having a meeting in the car with my assistant Carey on the way back. There's a whole agenda where she's parked stuff and I've parked stuff. So rather than emailing or slacking her in the moment and clogging up her day, it's not time-bound. There were time-bound things we talked about this morning on the way down, but all the stuff that can wait until Thursday waits until Thursday. So I think that's really important. Yeah, go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, so I have 2 related questions. A lot of what you're talking about gets at its core to purpose and values. So for example, your comment around more time, more money and all that, we're basically conditioned by our society to say that's what life is all about, that's what success is and all the rest of it. So how do you overcome that cultural bias of, what makes you successful, or, that type of paradigm? I mean, clearly, once you hit the wall, then it becomes obvious. But before that, is there a way of getting there in terms of prioritizing those things? And the second question related to that is, that first measurement is very measurable. Like, you can measure your time and your productivity and your profitability and all the rest of it. The other things are intangibles. They're hard to really wrap your arms around. And how do you get a sense that that's really achieving at the level that you want it to?
Harold, those are great questions that I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And I'm actually redefining right now. I'm 57. I'm looking ahead at what's ahead. And, I have enough time off in the year that I realize I don't think I'm a retirement guy. I don't think I can just lie in a hammock 12 months a year. I don't think that's going to work for me. And there's a really interesting book by Arthur C. Brooks called From Strength to Strength. First 2 chapters are very depressing, so I'm just warning you now. Felt like jumping off a cliff for a minute. And then, because he talks about what happens as you get older and how your contribution changes. But he said you should, in the latter part of your life, have a really interesting problem that you need to solve. And so we're debating that right now in my company, where I'm like, what do I want to spend the next 10 years trying to solve? And looking back at it, I realized, values is really important to me. So my family, I cheated my family way too often in my 30s, and I've apologized to my grown children. And now when they're around, I'm around. That doesn't mean I'm clinging to them, but it means work fits in a box. And I get to go hang out with them. If they want to go out on the boat, we go out on the boat. If they want to go hiking, we go hiking. If, we do that kind of thing with them. Time with my wife. I literally worked hard this week to set tonight and tomorrow morning aside before I fly out so that I get quality time with my wife after she returns after a week at a retreat. So, those are values that are really important to me. My faith is really important to me. That's the first hour of every day for me. Even this morning, when I had an early wake up, I got up a little bit earlier so I could spend some time at what matters most for me. But now I'm trying to think of what is, the church has all kinds of problems. I'll be the first one to talk about it. That's not what we're here to talk about today. But one of the things I'm weighing is to help create healthy leaders who produce healthy organizations. There's a lot of unhealth in church leaders. That's why you read all the headlines you do. And I'm not perfectly healthy, but I think there are better ways to live and worse ways to live. So maybe that's a huge problem we can't solve, but maybe we can work the next decade on it. Or to reverse the future of the church, which it looks like it's going down fast. That's a really big problem. So another way to ask that question is, what big problem are you solving with your life and in your work? And right now I'm running a company. We can solve whatever problem we want to. Elon Musk is trying to colonize Mars. That's great. And electrify vehicles. And Neuralink tried to make the AI human intelligence thing work. Those are really interesting problems to solve. So, out of my own beliefs and values, that's where I want to spend the next 10, 15 years of my life. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for one more, Peggy?
One more question.
One more question. Okay, at the back. Yes.
Do you think the Great Resignation is sort of a short-term blip?
That's a great question. I think I'm thinking of it as the Great Reset. So we have the Great Resignation. We have the Great Migration. You saw Toronto evacuate. And now we have unaffordable housing all over the province. We had a whole lot of people rethinking things. We've got a generation. I have 2 millennials. One of them's in BC, and he's probably going to work mobile for the next, he's a software engineer, computer engineer. He's probably going to work remotely for the next 3 years, just living for 3 months in Costa Rica, 3 months in Scotland, that kind of thing. I run a digital company. It's entirely remote. We only meet twice a year in person or on the road. So I think there's a great reset. And I think what COVID did is, and churches have a great evacuation. There's a lot of people who just said, yep, I'm done with church over the last few years. I think everyone's reassessing their priorities, deciding, do I want to work from home? Do I want to go to the commute every week? Or every day? Do I want to be stuck in traffic every morning? Traffic isn't what it was pre-pandemic coming down to Toronto anymore. We had a 15-minute delay today. Not bad. I think it's a great reset. And I think that's going to go on for a little bit longer. And I also wonder, you look at the war in Ukraine, we've got climate change happening. You look at Fiona, you've got Ian in Florida. I think the next 10 years, we've got midterm elections in the US, is going to be very unstable. And so I think people are going to be continually reevaluating things. And one of the strengths leaders have to bring to the table is flexibility and agility. So we had a period of relative stability from the late 90s to about 2019. And you can look at this as a great disruption. And I think it's way bigger than COVID. So I think you're going to have continual reassessment, the emergence of the gig economy where you don't even have a career, but just a bunch of different jobs that you string together until you can retire. I think people are rethinking everything right now, and I'm not sure that I see where the sun sets on that yet. So we're preparing for instability.